In today's program, we're going to talk about language. Human language, of course, but also animal language. We'll also find out about man's possibilities to understand animal language. Speaking a language is a very complex thing. It's not only a matter of using one's tongue, lips, and larynx to shape some 30 sounds correctly. Not only combining sounds to be able to pronounce thousands of words. Not only memorizing words. It's to be able to combine words ad infinitum to say simple and complex things in a multitude of different ways. Children can speak their mother tongue almost perfectly by the age of 4 or 5, even if their vocabulary and abstract thinking are still unsure. It's funny because the word infant comes from a Latin root meaning incapable of speaking. And yet infants only a few weeks old are already beginning to pronounce vowels, then consonants. They're only about 9 months old when they first say mama or dada. For children, talking is a game. It's fun, but it's also a way of satisfying their needs. Language enables man to affect his environment. At what point in his evolution did man discover this pleasure? It is thought that human language came into being some 100,000 years ago. This estimate is based on the study of human craniums, which indicate that at that time, man was endowed with a sufficiently developed speech apparatus to emit articulate sounds. But we don't know why man began speaking. Some believe it's because of genetic mutations. Others think that the arrival of language is connected to the refinement of man's activities. Language would enable humans to differentiate tools or explain certain procedures vital to the group's survival. In fact, language would have developed at the same pace as man's conquest over his environment. We do not know whether there was an original language, one that was the mother of all the languages spoken today. Linguists generally agree that the oldest known language is Sanskrit. It is believed to have appeared 7,000 years ago in a region corresponding to the southwest of the Soviet Union. However, it is very difficult to pinpoint the exact age of a language. There are only a very few old written documents to base our studies on, and before it is written, a language must first be spoken. The gap between the manifestation of a language and the time it is written down can be hundreds, even thousands of years. Some parallels can be drawn between the development of language through history and children's learning of their language. Children speak before writing, and the more complex their activities, the more refined their language. At birth, infants already communicate through facial expressions and cries. Gradually, they realize that by crying, they elicit responses. Then, as they make contact with the outside world and experience new things, their looks and gestures take on added meaning. Later, they associate sounds to the objects and people that make up their world. Psycholinguists have identified 3 essential factors in the normal development of language. These 3 factors correspond to the form, the contents, and the use of language. Parents and educators must first encourage children in their effort to pronounce words correctly. In other words, to master the form of language, so they will learn how things are said. Children need to grow up in a world that is rich in experience. The more they explore, the more their vocabulary grows. Vocabulary constitutes the contents of a language. Thus, children develop their ability to know what to say. Lastly, their use of language to reach their objective, whether by persuasion or by a lie,
is closely linked to the way in which parents and educators behave with and respond to them. This is what we call the why speaking, whereby children learn to become strategists and to use language like a tool to develop in society. By the time they have reached 5 or 6, children have acquired most of their language's structure. They can distinguish tenses or grasp a complex sentence including several related ideas. At this age, children can absorb an average of 22 new words a day. By the time he is an adult, man will have acquired a vocabulary of roughly 10,000 words. But in real fact, he will use between 3,000 and 5,000 words to make himself understood in most of his activities. It is estimated that there are about 3,000 languages, dialects, and patois in use today throughout the world. But any language can be learned by any child, whatever the child's origin. Thus, an Asian baby growing up in England will master the language of Shakespeare just as well as any British child. What is surprising is that all languages, in spite of their obvious differences, have common forms of grammar. Because of this, many linguists tend to believe that there exists a universal grammar common to all human beings. This universal grammar would be written in our genetic heritage. Similarities are as frequent between languages as are distinctions in the way people use a language. Thus, thanks to the sonograph, a device that measures the frequency and intensity of sounds, we have discovered that pronunciation, intonation, and accent are just as personal as fingerprints. While each individual has their own way of using language, the basic structures of human language are common to all.
Language is not a fixed tool. It changes constantly. It adapts to customs, institutions, new technologies. The words electricity, video camera, intercom were invented many years after Shakespeare's time. We don't always know how words are born, but we do know that they are objects of a social consensus. That's why language is such a powerful binder in our society. Man has placed so much importance on speech, sometimes to the detriment of other means of communication. Yet he has a gut reaction to the sound of a voice, a rhythm, a perfume, exactly like animals do. It could be that it was a certain perfume that made you say yes that Saturday evening so many years ago to that timid young man, the one who still lies beside you in bed today. Because human beings held a monopoly over speech, they thought they had a monopoly over communication. In Aesop's fables, animals talk human language, but actually they have their own language, and we are only beginning to understand it.
Si je suis malade, puis
Human beings communicate chiefly through sounds and gestures, and most studies on animal language have dealt with those two types of communication. But sounds and gestures are not the only means of communication. It was discovered that some insects communicate through chemical substances called pheromones. These chemical substances are also called social hormones because it is through them that colonies of insects survive and stay together. In noctuids, night-flying moths, the female secretes a pheromone from a gland on her underbelly at mating time. Male noctuids pick up the scent of the pheromone with their antenna. In response, they secrete another pheromone to tell the female they are ready to mate. However, the female has the last word as to who that male will be. The quantity of pheromones males produce gradually declines with age. Female noctuids are thus more apt to choose more fertile young males, as they favor the survival of the species. Chemical language is probably the oldest language used by living beings. But the more evolved the species, the more complex its language becomes. Birds, for instance, communicate in sounds and gestures like man does. We know that the songs of some male birds are not necessarily directed to females. They are rather a warning to other male birds to limit their territories. A female is seduced by the male who has proven his domination over other males. Recent studies tend to demonstrate that the broader a male bird's repertoire, the better his chances of reproducing. Birds also communicate among themselves by adopting various stances. The peacock expresses his reproduction impulses by fanning his tail. The goose has her own way of communicating with her fellow creature by adopting well-defined postures, signaling alarm, attack, or submission. The gestures and mimics of primates make for an even more developed nonverbal language. Monkeys communicate a great deal through facial expressions. Such mimicry helps orchestrate the whole social life of their band. Some of their mimics express attentiveness, others fear, anxiety, or aggressiveness. Monkeys also express themselves with their cries. These cries are not just emotional outbursts, they have precise meaning. Until very recently, it was believed there was only one cry of alarm within a given species of monkey. But researchers have made a fundamental discovery. Monkeys have a vocabulary. The warning cries vary according to the danger. 3 different such cries have been identified in the African vervet monkeys. If a snake approaches the group, a specific cry will tell the monkeys to stand on their hind legs and search the ground. If a dangerous earth mammal is close by, another cry warns the group, and the monkeys then clamber up a tree for protection. If it is an eagle approaching, the warning cry will send the monkeys scampering into the bushes for cover. This finding, made in the early 80s, gives us reason to believe that primates have a vocabulary and a language. Thanks to that language, they too can adapt to the world around them. The more refined our scientific approach, the more elaborate animal language is proving to be.
Perhaps it is because the language of animals is so perfectly adapted to their societies and their needs that we have such difficulty understanding them. We're as alien and puzzled in their presence as I am in front of a Japanese play. I'm awed by all these rituals, but their meaning escapes me. There is one question in particular that has always bothered scientists. Are animals capable of abstract and symbolic thought? Children are quick to understand that words represent things and accept that they can exist without actually being present. When an animal is able to combine words to make a sentence properly, make hypotheses based on abstract concepts, talk about the past and the future, about its imagination and its feelings, what would we conclude? That it thinks like man, that's all. But is that the only way of thinking? I'm convinced that animals know many things that are much more interesting than anything we may have taught them.
Not long ago, it was thought that language among animals only fulfilled very basic functions. Such a concept reflects our tendency to evaluate animals' communication skills by comparing them to our own. So instead of trying to understand the language of animals, researchers spent a lot of time trying to teach them our language. Some scientists believed they could improve and assess the intellectual abilities of monkeys by teaching them to communicate through gestures. It was by doing this that they reached the conclusion that while monkeys can make a link between a symbol and an object, they are unable to make coherent sentences, unable to establish logical ties between different concepts. But the researchers were probably on the wrong track. They thought they could judge an animal's intelligence and communication skills by attempting to teach them the grammar used by humans. It's only when we began studying animals in their natural environment that the complexity and variety of their communication became apparent. We now know that animals do communicate with each other, but in ways much more complex than we had imagined. More and more researchers are trying to connect the social behavior of animals to the sounds they make. They are not trying to teach them our language. They are trying to understand theirs. It is a difficult task. Beluga whales, for instance, emit dozens of different whistle sounds, sometimes only half a second long. These whistles are sent out on frequencies audible to the human ear. It is believed the belugas use these sounds to communicate with each other over distances of about half a kilometer. The beluga whales also emit pulsating sounds, short sounds repeated several times a second. These sounds, which resemble roars, are apparently used to communicate over short distances. They are thought to be associated to emotional situations as well, such as threats or attacks. Belugas also produce very short sounds, jingles. They produce hundreds of these per second. These jingles have ultrasonic frequencies and are thus inaudible to the human ear. The belugas themselves pick up the high-frequency jingles perfectly. We think they use them to locate their positions among themselves and to seek prey. However, these sounds could just as well serve to communicate. No research team has ever been able to prove whether or not these sounds are part of an elaborate language. The great variety of signals transmitted by cetaceans and the complexity of their social life would indicate that they have intellectual capacities until recently unsuspected. Some researchers even think that dolphins have a higher intelligence than ours. This thesis is upheld by an American neurophysiologist, John Lilly, who made an international name for himself by locating the centers of pleasure and pain in the human brain. He bases his theory on the fact that for some 15 million years, the size of the dolphin's brain has been comparable to that of the human being. However, the human brain, according to Lilly, has only been that size for 300,000 years. Therefore, over the 15 million year period, the intelligence of dolphins would have surpassed man's. Lilly's hypothesis is far from being shared by the majority of animal language specialists. Understanding the language of animals is the only means we have to find out how they perceive the world. Their language may be less limited than our studies would have us believe.
We don't only use words to communicate. Our intonation, facial expression, body language can say just as much. So be careful. Sometimes they express the opposite of what we're saying.